one thing that conventions historically have been is places to sort of hash out the platform, where the parties write down what they stand for, their ideas. In 2020, as you mentioned, where Trump had a lot more control, the Republicans famously got rid of the platform and said the platform is whatever Donald Trump wants it to be. Hi, welcome back to another episode of Power and Flower, a podcast about politics where a political operative and a political scientist try to make sense of what's going on in the world and offer as many smart pastry tips as we can at the end. My name is John Hagner.
I'm Seth Maskett.
And today we are going to talk about the Republican National Convention, which kicks off in Milwaukee any day now. Seth, you are a widely recognized expert on political parties. You know more about what happens at these than almost anybody I've ever met. And I am really excited for for me to get smarter about what's going to happen, but also for the listeners to get smarter. Full disclosure, I've been to some Democratic conventions. I have never been to a Republican convention. I've got a lot to learn, so I have a ton of questions for you about this.
Well, great. I'm excited to answer your questions. For what it's worth, I've never actually been to a Republican convention before.
Oh.
I've been to a few Democratic conventions. I was actually both a researcher and a delegate at the 2008 Democratic National Convention in Denver. So I got to experience both from the outside and the inside. Happy to talk about that, and also just sort of what we're likely to see go on in this 4-day event in Milwaukee.
I was also at the Democratic Convention in Denver, but I was not a delegate. I was in charge of running around and getting really good credentials for the delegates from Ohio to go to the best parties possible. So excellent. I spent 4 hours every morning harassing people for tickets, and then I took the rest of the day off, and I had a blast. But let's start at the highest possible level, right? Like, it is 2024. We've known who the nominees of these parties are going to be for a long time. We don't live in a world where there's a smoke-filled back room that, delegates have to go figure out what to do. Why in the modern era are we still having conventions? What's the purpose for parties in doing this every 4 years?
That is an excellent question. And technically, this is where the presidential nominations are made. That's only a technicality, though, and has been that way for more than half a century. It used to be that delegates from all over the country would gather together, and they would actually hammer out who was going to be the nominee. It used to be fairly common to not know who the party's presidential nominee was before the convention started. And it was really all about picking people who would go there, who would advocate for their own state's needs well, who would advocate for particular constituencies within the party. That was like, Abraham Lincoln, when he got the nomination in 1860, he was not widely expected to win that party's nomination. There were other way far better known candidates who were in the room for that. Franklin Roosevelt, it was not clear that he was going to get it in 1932. It was not clear even that Hubert Humphrey was going to get it in 1968, although probably. But really, it was the reforms since 1968, starting on the Democratic side, but ended up having an effect on the Republican side as well, that really changed the way presidential nominations occurred. And all the focus after that became on states increasingly having primary elections where that would determine who got which campaign got the most delegates from that. And really since 1972 forward, we've had a situation where we basically know who the nominee is going to be before the convention starts, simply by virtue of who has the largest percentage of delegates that are pledged to them. That just didn't used to be the case, but that's the case now. So what we've had there, for 50 plus years, is this 4-day event where, the drama over who the actual nominee would be has never really been much drama. That's not really been in much doubt. What you have, though, is a chance to have, and this is the thing I really do like about conventions, is that, like, whatever the Democratic Party or whatever the Republican Party is, it's all in one place at one time. That is, you have all these major elected officials there. You have party officials there. The RNC or the DNC is in the room. You have all these like aligned interest groups and aligned journalists and others. They're all kind of under one roof. And they're talking with each other and they're arguing with each other and they're figuring out what they're going to stand for. And they're coming out with something like a united vision for their party. And they broadcast that out over 4 straight days to say, this is what this party stands for now. This is why we like our nominee. It's a chance for people who challenged that nominee earlier on to come together and pledge their support for the nominee. And so you really get like a coherent, kind of a coherent campaign statement and platform for this is why we like our group. And it's a chance for voters aligned with that party to get this sort of 4-day message about what they like about their party, what they don't like about the other party. It's just sort of a set of reminders, and it brings partisans home functionally. Just reminding people like why they joined this team in the first place. And that's, I think that has some democratic value to it. There's some pageantry involved. Honestly, one of the innovations I've really liked the most in recent years was Democrats during their very online Zoom convention in 2020. They did the traditional roll call of the states. This is always a fun part of conventions where, just state by state, each of the delegations gets to explain what percentage, what votes each of the presidential candidates got from their state. And Democrats did a very online version of that where they went to, on location, people representing the different states all over the country. And it was kind of a really cool moment.
Everybody remembers the calamari guy from Rhode Island.
The calamari guy from Rhode Island was fantastic. And you wouldn't have gotten that otherwise.
Although I did recently read that he said he was voting for Trump this time. So I don't think we'll see him again.
Oh, my God. Biden lost the calamari guy? Oh, that's brutal.
Yeah.
Okay. I hope that answers your question. I went on for
Absolutely.
a while.
No, it was super helpful. So specifically, what are you watching for this year? Like, what of all of, you could be a lot of places. When you go to Milwaukee, what are you looking for?
So one of the reasons, like I'm going there for particular research reasons. I have spent the last year plus doing interviews and surveys of Republican county chairs all across the country. Now there's thousands of county chairs. I've been talking to a few hundred folks, but some of them are delegates to this convention. Some of them are just going because they're interested. So this is a chance for me to kind of follow up with them and just sort of understand for people who are like not people who are not at the top of the Republican Party, but they're also just not your run-of-the-mill voters either. They're kind of these middle-tier elites who are interested and have been paying attention, and they're there to close ranks. And I am interested in understanding just how they've read events over the last year and just how they see their party coming together. Whether, was like the fact that like Nikki Haley was mounting a kind of interesting challenge to Donald Trump for a few months earlier this year. Is that interesting? Are there parts of the party that aren't really behind Trump today? Has everyone really closed ranks? And just sort of, how they're viewing things going forward. I'm also, one of the kind of interesting things, particularly in the era of Trump, is who's not in the room. In 2016, that was considered like a hostile Trump takeover of the Republican Party. There were a lot of people like John McCain did not go there. There were a lot of people who did not want to be part of that. And some who did. And so I'm sort of curious to get a sense of, who's there, who's missing. And also looking for, there's these occasional moments of drama that are, I think you sort of have to ratchet down what your expectation of drama is. But like in 2016, Ted Cruz, who had challenged Donald Trump, he was one of Trump's main challengers toward the end there. He came there to speak. He did not pledge his support for Donald Trump at that time. He instead encouraged delegates to vote their conscience. Now, that in itself was a fairly radical act for that moment. That was just basically saying we don't all have to close ranks behind Donald Trump. He eventually did, along with everyone else. But at least in that moment, that was a fairly significant event.
Mike Lee from Utah, who's now one of Trump's biggest cheerleaders, I think was on the floor applauding loudly for Ted Cruz. So,
yeah.
Every dog has his day. Do you think there'll be any sort of shows of dissent like that? Or do you think that those folks have been kicked out of the Republican Party at this point?
I do not expect to see a lot of resistance. My impression is the Trump folks have a lot stronger control over the party and over the convention than they did in 2016. That if anyone was going to go there and make even sort of a vaguely critical of Trump speech, that would have been vetted out a long time ago, and most of those folks would have sort of selected out of the convention already. They might be more aggressively kicked out. But I think we saw in 2020, I think a much more tightly scripted Republican convention, largely held on the White House lawn, which was probably illegal. But
well, as we've learned, laws are whatever John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett think the laws are, so it's fine.
Exactly.
Oh, Lord. Everybody went to law school. Get your refunds now. So one thing that conventions historically have been is places to sort of hash out the platform, where the parties write down what they stand for, their ideas. In 2020, as you mentioned, where Trump had a lot more control, the Republicans famously got rid of the platform and said the platform is whatever Donald Trump wants it to be, which I thought by itself was a remarkable document. Are they going to bring back a more conventional platform this year? And if so, do you think it matters?
So what little I've heard about this suggests that there is actually a platform being generated. There is a platform committee. There was a news story I just saw recently suggesting that the platform committee will be meeting in secret. So they will not be open to press. They will not be open to outside onlookers. That's a very new thing. This is usually an open process. And I was going to mention something else I'm hoping to learn more about, and I would love to actually be in the room for, is the generation of a platform. That is actually besides just like what the printed platform looks like, that's an interesting moment in itself when a platform is generated. Because what you see is, and Republicans, again, that's used to be a very public process. Democrats will have a public process in theirs. It's a process by which different representatives of different interest groups, community leaders, religious leaders, business leaders, and so forth will be coming in and saying, I would really like the platform to say this. This is important to the people I represent. And it gives you an idea. So like, this is a chance for sort of people to like say, I want the Republican Party to look like this and to move in this direction. And you get a sense of how influential groups are by how much the party moves as a result. And so it's important in that sense, in that it's a chance for different competing groups to hammer out their differences. I do get the sense that this matters to some extent. We've seen in recent years, state Republican Party platforms have changed a lot. And some of those are consistent with things that Trump has talked about. And some of those are just going off in just wild different directions. There's some stuff in the most recent platforms in the Texas Republican Party and the Idaho Republican Party, where they want to like change their, actively trying to change the way elections are done. Some of them are talking about creating like an electoral college within the state level. Some of them are talking about moving to silver coinage, like all sorts of fascinating things that you just really don't see much anymore.
Some of them calling for the death penalty for people who have abortions.
Sure, why not?
Yeah, why not? Why not?
And, so you get the impression that, like, at least to these folks in the room, yes, what these stances are matter. It's not like most voters have no idea what is in a platform. And so I would not say it matters at the level of the voters. Voters are not like, the number of people who are undecided between Trump and Biden and are going to read the party platforms to make their decision is approximately zero. But it does matter because these are things that elected or the party's nominees are running on. These are things that they've at least signed on to some extent. And it does give you an idea of what direction the party is going to be moving in the next few years. I think the fact that the party didn't come up with a platform in 2020 and said, we just stand for whatever Trump stands for, was a really important moment and told us something. It spoke volumes about where the Republican Party was. I doubt that the party's going to produce anything that Donald Trump isn't comfortable with at this point. But given that he is often fairly vague on a lot of policy that isn't about immigration, this is important for telling us, what policy would look like under a second Trump administration. So it's important in that regard.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. Yeah, I know Democrats have been pointing to is like this is the blueprint for what a second Trump administration would look like. It'll be interesting to see if they try to use the platform to push back on any of that. If there's any, hey, this is actually who we are and what we're running on. Don't trust this stuff that you're reading in the Project 2025, or if they double down on it and if they say, yeah, this is the playbook and this is what we're going to do. I think the other thing that we expect sort of to be the news out of convention is always, who the vice president is, who the running mate is. It's usually announced a day or two before the convention meets, and then it becomes a big part of the action. Donald Trump famously doesn't love to share the spotlight. Do you think that the running mate, whoever he or she is going to be a big part of the Republican convention, or do you think it's going to be the Trump show?
I think it depends who that vice presidential running mate actually is. And we've seen the way Trump has been teasing this decision for months. I mean, he treats it's very much in the style of a game show or reality show for him, which that's consistent with his past. If it's someone who's very well known, that's one thing. If it's someone who a lot of voters don't have much of a sense of, the convention is traditionally an opportunity to have them, to introduce them to the country. Like the 2008 Republican convention was a fascinating example of this, where John McCain picked Sarah Palin like hours before the convention started. And the convention, no one outside Alaska knew anything about her. The convention was an opportunity to introduce her. She gave, honestly, probably the best speech of her political career at that. She got actually, it didn't end up being great for her in the long run, but in that week she was looking great.
Yeah.
And it was a chance to not only introduce her, but sort of capitalize on her charisma, on her speaking ability. And that gave the party a little bit of a boost.
Well, and the breath of fresh air, right? That she was new, she was interesting.
So if Trump goes with someone like if it goes with someone like Vivek Ramaswamy or something like that, yeah, it'll be a chance for him to give a big, fun, dynamic speech in which he does nothing but praise Trump. It would be a tightly vetted speech, but there'd be at least a couple hours of this convention devoted to that.
Yeah. I expect, he's going to go with Doug Burgum because he wants $1 billion added to his campaign coffers and his legal defense fund, but we'll see.
That's not a bad call.
I remember the Sarah Palin choice really clearly because I was in Denver at the Democratic convention and they announced Palin the day after. And it blunted a lot of the momentum that Obama had coming out of that convention because it was an exciting pick. And I think they rolled it out at a really smart time. I was sitting on the tarmac trying to fly from Denver to Dayton, Ohio, which is where Sarah Palin was announced. And my flight was 4 hours delayed because they closed the airspace above Dayton. And we just sat on the run to the tarmac watching the coverage and, really wondering if this was going to change everything. So my last question for you. The convention is in Milwaukee. Wisconsin, obviously, one of the most important swing states for the presidential race, but also for the Senate race. There's some important House races there. Do you think it matters where this convention is? Do you think that this will give the Republicans an advantage in Wisconsin? Could it hurt? Like, what is it being in Milwaukee? What does being in Milwaukee mean to the convention?
I've seen there's actually a handful of political science studies on this. Some which find there actually is a bit of a boost for the campaign for holding their convention there, and some which really have a hard time finding any effect at all. Um, I guess to some extent, what it allows a campaign to do is just it's more visible in that state for a little while. Particularly for it's interesting to think about this. I mean, yeah, Wisconsin is a swing state. Milwaukee is a very Democratic city, and with a high percentage of non-white voters. Um, it's not like Trump and his fellow Republicans are going to have a lot of interaction with people in that city. In fact, some of the coverage I've found so far suggests that like they're kind of under invested in the city so far, that like a surprising number of restaurants, you can still get reservations there right now, which is not normally true a few weeks before a convention. But there will be a lot of media attention for the Republicans in Wisconsin media. A lot of the party leaders who are there are going to be like becoming more familiar to voters and to Wisconsin journalists and others, which probably does help a little bit. It actually has a little bit of an economic boost to the region, which can have some effect that people might credit the Republicans for. So it's hard to say. This occurs a few months before the convention. I wouldn't expect there to be that big an impact, but it probably doesn't hurt. And it might actually be a little bit of a good thing in the end. I say probably doesn't hurt. I think like I'm actually sort of curious if anyone's looked at the effect of like the 1968 Democratic Convention on the Illinois vote. Like,
Yeah.
It is possible for coverage to be very, very bad, but usually it isn't.
Yeah.
Usually it's mostly feel good things.
Yeah, I know that the Democratic Convention was supposed to be in Milwaukee in 2020 before it was moved to Zoom. So I think it's smart of the Republicans to come and say like, "Hey, the Dems weren't here, but we're going to show up," but only if they present themselves well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But that's a lot of convention talk. We got to get to what's important, which is
Yes.
baking.
Yes.
We talked a little bit. We've talked recently about sort of our favorite things to make. Do you have any really good baking horror stories?
I was trying to think about what's a good horror story. I know I've made some underwhelming things. Well, okay, one quick one, and this is, I think everyone who bakes has made this mistake at some point, was that either you substitute salt for sugar. People have done that.
Yep.
I did one where I had very coarse salt, and I just assumed, oh, it just dissolves, and it doesn't. And so I made these cookies that were like sort of little salt surprises. But it's actually not so much a baking thing. Actually, if I can pivot, it was actually I had a cocktail tragedy. So Hans Knoll and I have a textbook called Political Parties that came out with W.W. Norton Publishers in 2021. We are working on a second edition of that right now. But it turns out we know a person named Lindsay Meerbaum, who is a cookbook author and cocktail book author. And one of the things she does is actually makes cocktails out of book covers. So she's like a cool book cover that she's inspired by, and she makes a cocktail version of it. And she honored us by making a cocktail version of our textbook. And it is a gorgeous cocktail that she made. And I set about to try and recreate it myself. And it was horrible. I made a really ugly cocktail, and it is hilariously ugly. And so I'll make sure to post that photo on our Substack. And of course the original, which was truly beautiful. And if I can ask you, John, what is a true baking tragedy that you've had?
So there's a couple that I could mention, but my favorite story in 2022, I was managing a campaign and got really burnt out, and I needed to take a break. So I ran away and I went to pastry school. I quit my job. I sold my house. I went to Paris and I enrolled at Le Cordon Bleu, where I studied pastry. It was an incredible experience. But it was at that time, the pastry program was 59 women and me. I was the only man in the program, and I was one of the only people who spoke French. So I spent a lot of time talking with the chefs. Mostly they liked me. They thought that I did good work. But we had to learn how to make eclairs. And my eclairs were the ugliest thing that my chef had ever seen in his entire life. And he just looked at me and he said, "You should never try to do this again." He told me that I had clumsy American fingers and that I would never make a proper eclair with my clumsy American hands, and that it would be better for him and for France if I just stopped. Which, I took that personally, wasn't great. In order to graduate from the Cordon Bleu, our final exam was we had to memorize 12 recipes that we had been given. And we were going to walk into a room, and the ingredients for one of those 12 would be sitting on the counter, and we had to recognize what they were and execute it perfectly with no notes, no recipes, no anything. So I walk in, and what is sitting on the counter but all of the ingredients for a chocolate eclair? And knowing full well that the chef had told me to never do it again, I had to face my fear and do it. And I did pass. So couldn't have been that.
Whew. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right.
Did that scar you for life, or do you feel like
For
you got
life.
through that moment?
But I might open a bakery called Family Sized Eclairs just to rub it in his face.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this conversation. This was great, John.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Have fun in Milwaukee, and make sure that you tell us all about it.
Oh, I'll provide plenty of details. Okay. Thank you all for listening. I hope to talk to you again soon. Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you very much for listening to Power and Flour. This episode was produced by Eli Masket. We will be recording throughout this election season up until the November election.